The email landed in my inbox at 7:13 a.m., subject line simply Davies. I almost deleted it without opening it. 10 years. 10 years since I'd last seen Mr. Davies, and frankly, I tried to bury any memories of him and that particular trip. The email itself was unremarkable. He'd started with a generic greeting, a polite inquiry about my life, and then, after a paragraph about the bittersweet nature of remembering old classmates, he wrote, "You were right to be suspicious about that field trip." My stomach tightened. It wasn't a question, just a statement, a single, unsettling sentence that sliced through the pleasantries like a shard of glass. I reread it, scanning the rest of the email for some explanation, some context, but there was nothing. Just that chilling declaration. Mr. Davies was a meticulous man, a stickler for procedure, and I'd always found him a little intense. He'd chosen me, of all people, to lead the small group of students on that botany excursion to Blackwood Forest. Now, 10 years later, he was reminding me I'd been right to distrust it. I clicked on the attached image, a grainy black and white photograph. It showed us, my classmates and I, standing in a clearing deep within the forest. The trees were unusually tall, almost skeletal, and the light was strangely muted, filtered through a thick canopy. I recognized the location instantly, the oddly shaped rock formation that served as our base camp. But something about the photo felt wrong. It wasn't just the quality, it was the feeling it evoked. A sense of quiet dread, a subtle but palpable wrongness. I pulled up the email sent date July 12, 2013. That was the day of the trip. I scrolled back through my old email archives searching for any trace of correspondence with Mr. Chris Davies. Nothing. It was as if he'd simply vanished from my life after that. I remembered the whispers after we returned that the trip had been unusual, that the research team, led by a Dr. Albright, was conducting something beyond simple botanical study. I dismissed it as adolescent paranoia, the product of a few too many late nights fueled by cheap pizza and rumors. But now, hearing his words, seeing this photograph, a cold knot of recognition tightened in my gut. I opened a new document and started typing, documenting everything I remembered, every detail, no matter how small or insignificant it seemed. I needed to understand what he knew, what he was trying to tell me. The email felt like a key, unlocking a door I'd spent a decade trying to keep shut. It was a disturbing reminder of a past I'd desperately tried to forget, and I had a growing sense that revisiting it might be far more dangerous than I'd ever imagined. The attached image was a shock, a jagged intrusion into the sterile white of the document. It wasn't the clearing, not really. It was a gate. Rust, thick and angry, consumed most of it, but enough remained to recognize the brutal, geometric lines of the Blackwood Research Facility's entrance. The photograph was grainy, almost entirely black and white, the image fractured as if taken through a rain-streaked window. Figures, blurry, indistinct, stood before it, silhouetted against a light that seemed to emanate from the trees themselves. It wasn't a natural light, it was muted, sickly, and it held a strange, unsettling depth. Beneath the image, Mr. Davies's words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Some memories are best left undisturbed. I stared at the email, at the photograph, at Davies' chilling warning, and felt a cold dread bloom in my chest. It wasn't just the unsettling nature of the image or the abrupt cryptic message. It was the sheer weight of implication. Davies wasn't just confirming my suspicions, he was validating them. He was admitting that something had happened, something he'd tried to bury. The whispers about the research hadn't been idle rumors, hadn't been the ramblings of a slightly eccentric botany professor. There was a deliberate secrecy surrounding the trip, a guardedness that permeated every interaction with Mr. Davies and Dr. Albright. Albright, in particular, was always careful, almost unnervingly so, when discussing the specimens we were collecting. He spoke of unique cellular structures and accelerated growth patterns, with a detached clinical tone that never quite reached his eyes. I scrolled back through my notes, frantically searching for anything that might corroborate Davies's claim. The clearing, I remembered it vividly. The trees were wrong. Not just tall, though they were impossibly so, their branches skeletal and reaching, almost grasping. There was a distortion in the air, a subtle warping of light and sound. It wasn't a dramatic effect, more like a persistent hum beneath everything, a feeling of being watched. I dismissed it then as fatigue, as the inherent weirdness of a forest steeped in centuries of folklore. Now it felt like a carefully constructed illusion, a layer of obfuscation designed to conceal something far more sinister. I started to record my recollections with a new urgency, detailing everything I could remember about the day. The rain that started just as we entered the forest, the way the ferns seemed to grow at an unnatural rate, the peculiar silence broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water. I focused on the physical sensations, the smells, damp earth, something metallic, and a faint, sickly sweet odor I couldn't quite place. I wrote about Dr. Albright's insistence on precise measurements, his obsession with mapping the growth patterns of the plants. I wrote about the unsettling feeling of being followed, of not being alone in the forest. As I wrote, a growing conviction settled over me. This wasn't just a research trip. It was something far more complicated, far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. And Mr. Davies, in his final unsettling message, wasn't just warning me. He was offering me a glimpse into a truth I desperately needed to understand, a truth that could potentially unravel everything I thought I knew about myself and the events of that long ago day in Blackwood Forest. The compulsion hit me in waves, a rising tide of need to know. Davy's email had been the catalyst, but it was the memory itself, previously buried under layers of adolescent embarrassment and a vague sense of unease, that was now demanding attention. I started with the obvious, my school records. 10 years of misplaced documents, forgotten file cabinets, and bureaucratic indifference had created a monumental task. The school archivist, a perpetually disgruntled man named Mr. Henderson, initially resisted, claiming the Blackwood Trip files were archives due to the unconventional nature of the research. That phrase, unconventional, echoed Davy's words, solidifying my suspicion. It took 3 agonizing hours, a generous bribe of stale donuts, and a pointed reminder of potential legal ramifications. But Mr. Teen, Henderson finally coughed up the files. They weren't neatly organized. They were a chaotic jumble of photocopies, handwritten notes, and official looking reports bound with fraying twine. The initial documentation was exactly what I'd expected, a standard field trip itinerary, detailed observations of local plant species, mostly ferns and various mosses, and a list of personnel myself, Davies, Dr. Carbatha, Albright, and 2 graduate students. The descriptions of the flora were unremarkable, almost sterile in their detail. Significant specimens of Polypodium vulgare noted, consistent growth patterns observed in Lycopodium clavatum. It was painfully ordinary, a deliberate attempt, I realized, to mask something. Then I found it tucked away in a supplemental appendix, a heavily redacted document titled Project Verdant. The text within was sparse, filled with technical jargon about cellular regeneration, accelerated metabolic rates, and a recurring phrase, controlled environment zone alpha. It was here that Dr. Kentelic, Albright's detached clinical tone took on a chilling significance. He'd referred to unique cellular structures observed in the plants, but this document detailed experiments conducted within the Controlled Environment Zone Alpha, a section of the Blackwood Research Facility. The facility itself apparently was a repurposed, heavily fortified greenhouse located deep within the forest, a place the official reports consistently avoided describing in detail. The redacted portions detailed methods of manipulating plant growth, including the application of nutrient solutions and exposure to specific sonic frequencies. A hand drawn map accompanied the document, depicting a complex network of tunnels and chambers beneath the greenhouse. A single circled area marked Observation Deck 7 was accompanied by a chilling note: subject response, elevated heart rate, transient visual distortions. The last entry, dated the day of the trip, was simply Albright requesting immediate cessation of Experiment 4. I slammed the file shut, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. The routine study of local flora had been a carefully constructed facade, and I just stumbled upon a terrifying glimpse behind the curtain. The routine study of local flora felt like a deliberate lie now, a carefully constructed euphemism for something far more sinister. The air in the small office was thick with the scent of decaying paper and the metallic tang of my own rising anxiety. I needed to get out, to move, to force myself to think clearly. I grabbed my jacket, pulling it on with a frantic haste that felt completely inappropriate for a Tuesday afternoon. As I was about to shut the file cabinet, I noticed a small folded piece of paper tucked beneath the Project Verdant document. It was a photograph, faded and slightly blurred, of Dr. Albright. He was standing in front of the greenhouse, a clipboard in his hand, a small, almost unsettlingly bright smile plastered on his face. Beside him, a group of us, the students, myself included, stood awkwardly, our faces a mixture of boredom and apprehension. There was something unsettling about the image, a subtle tension in the air that I hadn't consciously registered before. It wasn't just the sterile environment of the greenhouse or the watchful gaze of Dr. Albright. It was something deeper, a sense of unease that seemed to emanate from the plants themselves. I stared at the photograph and a wave of nausea washed over me. The isolation of Blackwood Forest, the unsettling silence broken only by the hum of the greenhouse's ventilation system, the way Dr. Traders, Albright seemed to observe us with an almost clinical detachment, it all coalesced into a single, horrifying realization. This wasn't just a field trip. This was an experiment. Not a scientific one necessarily, but an experiment nonetheless. The routine study of local flora was a cover, a justification for what was really happening within those reinforced walls. I shifted my weight, trying to ground myself, to dismiss the creeping dread, but it was no use. The memory of the subject response entries, the frantic scribblings about elevated heart rates and visual distortions, flooded back. It was as if the plants themselves were reacting to something we were unknowingly contributing to. I felt a primal urge to flee, to escape the suffocating atmosphere of that place. The air in the office felt colder now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't just the lingering presence of Dr. Albright's image, it was something more fundamental. A sense of being scrutinized, dissected, by forces beyond my understanding. The nausea hadn't fully subsided, a dull throb behind my eyes. I needed to do something, anything, to wrestle back some control. I started with the obvious: Blackwood Forest itself. The local library, a surprisingly well-stocked place for a town this size, held the key, or so I hoped. I spent the next few hours lost in dusty archives, tracing the history of the forest, a task initially motivated by morbid curiosity but quickly shifting into something far more deliberate. What I found was unsettling, a slow, creeping revelation that shattered the neatly constructed narrative of a simple botany excursion. Blackwood wasn't just a forest, it had been for a significant period, the late 1950s and early 60s, a privately funded research facility known as the Hawthorne Institute. The records were fragmented, deliberately obscured, but pieced together from old newspaper clippings and a handful of surviving personnel files. It was a center dedicated to behavioral psychology. The focus wasn't on treating mental illness, it was on observing, manipulating, and ultimately understanding human responses to specific stimuli. The director, a Dr. Silas Thorne, was a figure shrouded in secrecy, his research papers marked Restricted Access Level Omega. The Institute's abrupt closure in 1968 was attributed to unforeseen operational challenges and a subsequent restructuring. The official explanation, presented in a bland press release, felt manufactured, a carefully constructed smokescreen. But the underlying details revealed their painstaking investigation painted a far more sinister picture. Hawthorne's work involved a series of controlled experiments involving isolated subjects, monitoring their reactions to sensory deprivation, altered environments, and, chillingly, specific audio frequencies. The research revolved around the concept of cognitive dissonance and the malleability of the human mind. Then I found it, a small, almost forgotten article tucked away in the back of the regional archives. It was a brief report from the Blackwood Gazette dated December 1967. The headline screamed, "Local residents report mysterious disappearances." The article detailed a string of unexplained vanishings in the surrounding villages: hikers, farmers, even a young boy playing near the forest's edge, all within a radius of approximately 5 miles of Hawthorne Institute. The disappearances were attributed to wild animal attacks, a convenient dismissal offered by local law enforcement. But the article's author, a local journalist named Elias Harding, suggested a more unsettling possibility. Harding wrote of a persistent feeling of surveillance among the residents, a sense of being watched, and hinted at rumors of strange lights and unusual noises emanating from the forest. The article mentioned a pattern that the disappearances always seemed to coincide with periods of heightened activity at the Hawthorne Institute. I closed the file, the paper thin and brittle in my hands. The hum of the library's fluorescent lights seemed to intensify, and I felt that familiar prickle of unease, the sensation of being watched. It was no longer just the image of Dr. Albright, it was the legacy of Hawthorne, a ghost of manipulation and disappearance woven into the very fabric of Blackwood Forest. The hum of the library's fluorescent lights seemed to amplify the unsettling silence, a counterpoint to the frantic drumming of my own pulse. I needed to ground myself, to find something tangible beyond the swirling anxieties fueled by Davies's cryptic emails and the Hawthorne Institute's shadowed past. I decided to revisit the local archives, hoping to unearth something beyond the official, sanitized records. The Blackwood Gazette, even from its dusty recesses, offered a more raw, immediate perspective. I spent the next few hours meticulously sifting through the microfiche, the image of the newspaper's print blurred by time and handling. The early 1960s section was a chaotic mess of advertisements for Briley-cream and poodle skirts, but as I moved deeper, a thread began to emerge, a series of articles concerning unexplained disappearances in the surrounding valleys. They were brief, almost dismissive, tucked away in the back pages, always attributed to wild animal attacks or accidents in the wilderness. But the frequency, the sheer volume of reports clustered around the time of Hawthorne's operation, was unsettling. One article, dated October 27, 1967, stood out. It detailed the disappearance of a young shepherd named Thomas Bellwether, who had vanished without a trace while tending his flock near Blackwood Creek. The article quoted Sheriff Brody's statement, probably wandered off, lost his way. Happens all the time in these woods. But a small, almost insignificant note at the bottom, penned by an anonymous source, changed everything. It referenced strange occurrences, reported by locals, a heightened sense of disorientation, a feeling of being tracked, and accounts of a peculiar rhythmic humming emanating from the forest. The source claimed the humming was connected to the Hawthorne Institute and its experiments. There was no name, just a single, chilling sentence. The woods remember. I photocopied the article, the paper now a fragile echo of a forgotten crime. As I folded it up, I felt a shift, a subtle alteration in the library's atmosphere. The air grew colder, and the prickle of unease intensified. No longer just a vague feeling, but a sharp, focused pressure behind my eyes. It wasn't just Dr. Albright or the Hawthorne Institute. It was the cumulative weight of these vanished lives, their stories silenced by official denials and local ignorance. I realized with a sickening certainty that the disappearances weren't merely coincidences. They were a consequence of something far more deliberate, far more insidious. I closed the file, the paper thin and brittle in my hands. The hum of the library's fluorescent lights seemed to intensify, and I felt that familiar prickle of unease, the sensation of being watched. It was no longer just the image of Dr. Albright. It was the legacy of Hawthorne, a ghost of manipulation and disappearance woven into the very fabric of Blackwood Forest. The phone felt cold against my palm, the plastic slick with a sudden, inexplicable sweat. I'd been obsessing over Mr. Davies's email for weeks, poring over the digitized transcripts, chasing dead ends in the Hawthorne Institute's archived records. Now this, a reply, terse and unsettling, felt like a direct injection of dread. It wasn't from Davies himself, just a forwarded message, a single sentence typed in a font that seemed to bleed into the white of the screen. Kronos. I hit reply before I could second guess myself, typing a carefully worded request for clarification regarding the Blackwood Forest field trip. I wanted to know what Project Verdant truly entailed, what subject response meant, and most importantly, who was behind it all. The response came almost instantly. It wasn't typed, but rather a recording, a voice clipped and devoid of emotion. The field trip was a collaboration, a discreet investigation conducted by Kronos Corporation. The Hawthorne Institute was merely a location. There was a pause, a technical glitch perhaps, before the voice continued. Your involvement was deemed suitable. The Kronos Corporation's research focused on human response to extreme stimuli. Specifically, we explored the malleability of memory and perception under controlled conditions. The forest, with its inherent isolation and naturally occurring acoustic properties, provided an ideal environment for experimentation. I read the message 3 times, the words settling into a chilling confirmation of my darkest suspicions. Kronos. The name echoed with a sterile corporate menace that dwarfed the unsettling fervor of the Hawthorne Institute. The nutrient solutions weren't about botany, they were about manipulating biochemistry. The sonic frequencies weren't simply a scientific curiosity, they were tools of influence and cognitive dissonance. It was a deliberate strategy, a calculated assault on the mind. I switched off the phone, the silence in the library suddenly oppressive. The fluorescent lights seemed to buzz with a new malevolent energy. I needed to move, to process. I pulled out my laptop and started researching Kronos Corporation. The initial searches were frustratingly sparse. The company had been dissolved in 1972, a casualty of internal disputes and a series of damning reports regarding its research practices. But then I found it, a small, almost obscure article in the Manchester Guardian from 1971. It detailed a whistleblower's allegations of unethical experimentation involving human subjects, claims dismissed at the time as the ramblings of a disgruntled employee. The article mentioned a key figure, Elias Thorne, Kronos' lead behavioral psychologist. I spent the next hour tracing Thorne's movements, piecing together a fragmented history. He disappeared shortly after Kronos' dissolution, presumed to have fled the country. But the article hinted at a network of former employees scattered across Europe, working in obscure research labs and private consulting firms. My fingers flew across the keyboard, generating a list of potential contacts, a tangled web of names and addresses. It felt like I was assembling a puzzle with missing pieces, a puzzle that threatened to reveal something far more horrifying than I had initially imagined. The list, generated with a chilling efficiency, dominated my screen. It wasn't exhaustive, certainly not. Kronos had been meticulous about obfuscation, but it was enough to start. I began with Dr. Alistair Finch, a name that appeared repeatedly in the subject response logs alongside Thorne. Finch had been listed as a senior acoustic specialist, a role that now seemed grotesquely apt. His last known address was in Prague, a city I'd been itching to visit anyway. I booked a flight, justifying it as journalistic curiosity, though a darker current of urgency propelled me forward. Prague was a maze of cobblestone streets and centuries-old buildings, all reflecting a gray, persistent rain. The address led me to a dilapidated apartment building in the Hýzdržičkov district, a place where shadows seemed to cling to the damp walls. The building manager, a woman named Helena, remembered Finch. Alistair? Yes, a quiet man, she said, her eyes scanning me with a cautiousness that felt entirely appropriate. He left abruptly, about 10 years ago. Said he was pursuing private research. She pointed me towards a small, cluttered storage unit. Finch's belongings, apparently. Inside, amidst stacks of audio equipment, notebooks filled with dense mathematical equations, and unsettlingly pristine white noise generators, I found a series of correspondence, emails exchanged with Kronos representatives detailing the progress or lack thereof of the Blackwood Protocol. They were chillingly precise, discussing alterations to the sonic frequency parameters, refinements to the cognitive dissonance sequences, and disturbingly, the optimization of subject distress levels. It became clear this wasn't simply research, it was exploitation. A particularly jarring email, dated just weeks before Kronos' closure, referenced a Phase 3 assessment and detailed a plan to increase the duration of sensory deprivation sessions for Subject 47. The subject, identified only as Bellwether, was, of course, Thomas Bellwether, the shepherd. It confirmed my suspicions. The rhythmic humming wasn't a coincidence. It was a carefully orchestrated stimulus, designed to induce a state of heightened suggestibility, a vulnerability ripe for manipulation. I photographed everything, meticulously documenting the evidence. As I was leaving, Helena stopped me. "Be careful," she said, her voice low. "Some things are best left undisturbed." She wouldn't elaborate, but her words carried a weight of unspoken knowledge, a warning about the lingering darkness of Blackwood Forest. I knew with a sickening certainty that my investigation had only just begun, and that the pieces of this horrifying puzzle were far more complex and far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. The rain had stopped, but the air in the old Blackwood Institute building still hung thick with the scent of mildew and something else. Something faintly metallic, like old blood. I'd spent the last few hours sifting through the building's archives, a chaotic mess of dusty files and brittle photographs. Helena's warning echoed in my ears, a low hum of apprehension. But the compulsion to understand, to unravel this tangled history, was too strong to resist. I'd found a series of meticulously organized boxes labeled Project Nightingale, and within them, a trove of disturbing documents. The files detailed a phased approach to psychological manipulation, far more sophisticated than I'd initially suspected. The early phases, focused on subject response, revolved around controlled stimuli, carefully calibrated nutrient solutions designed to induce specific physiological reactions, and, chillingly, the systematic deployment of sonic frequencies, purportedly to disrupt neural pathways and create disorientation. But it was the documentation from Phase 2 that truly cemented my unease. It described the deliberate induction of fear, utilizing imagery and narrative designed to trigger primal anxieties. There were charts detailing the progression of panic, the measurable increase in heart rate, the dilation of pupils. It was cold, clinical, and utterly terrifying. Then I found the notes relating to sensory deprivation. Repeated sessions of isolation, lasting anywhere from 12 to 72 hours, were documented, coupled with cognitive dissonance exercises, paradoxical statements, illogical scenarios, attempts to break down an individual's sense of reality. The rationale, scribbled in Thorne's neat handwriting, spoke of unlocking latent psychological vulnerabilities and facilitating rapid behavioral modification. It was a catalog of mental torture. A particularly unsettling entry detailed alterations to the Blackwood Protocol, suggesting a shift in methodology following the 1968 Hawthorne Institute closure. There were notations about increased subject reactivity and the need for more robust control measures. It was clear that the initial experiments hadn't gone as planned. The research had escalated. I meticulously photographed each document, painstakingly recording the file numbers and cross referencing them with the previous subject response entries. As I was examining a thick file on Subject 47, Thomas Bellwether, the shepherd, I noticed something odd. The page was folded in a way that suggested it had been concealed. I carefully unfolded it, revealing a small folded map of the Institute's basement, marked with a single prominent X. Beneath the map, a handwritten note: Access Point Level 3. My pulse quickened. This wasn't just a research facility, it was a prison, and I was beginning to suspect that the key to unlocking its secrets lay hidden beneath my feet. The map was brittle, the paper yellowed with age, the ink faded to a sickly brown. I traced the X with my finger, a cold dread settling over me. It was a ridiculous impulse, really, to follow this map into the bowels of the Hawthorne Institute. But the idea of simply leaving it alone, of letting Elias Thorne's legacy remain buried, felt wrong. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag, the beam cutting through the oppressive darkness of the basement corridor. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic and faintly antiseptic. The X marked a section of wall that looked no different from the rest gray concrete, stained with water damage. But I pressed against it, feeling for any sign of a latch, a seam, anything. After a few minutes of fruitless searching, my hand brushed against something unexpected, a small, almost imperceptible indentation. I pressed harder, and with a low groan of protesting metal, a section of the wall slid inwards, revealing a narrow, bricked-over chamber. Dust motes danced in the flashlight beam as I squeezed through the opening. The chamber was small, barely 10 by 10 feet, but it was crammed with files, hundreds of them, stacked neatly on metal shelving. They were categorized not by subject but by date, meticulously detailing every session of Subject 47, Thomas Bellwether. There were notes on nutrient intake, variations in sonic frequency exposure, and, chillingly, detailed observations of Bellwether's emotional state, his anxiety, his confusion, his growing sense of despair. Then I found the audio recordings. A battered cassette player sat on a small metal table, and a handful of cassettes were neatly arranged beside it. Hesitantly, I inserted one and pressed play. The sound that emerged was horrifying. It was Bellwether's voice, his own voice, but distorted, fragmented, layered with a disorienting echo. He was speaking, reciting passages from Shakespeare, but his words were punctuated by screams, by ragged breaths, by the insistent, droning hum of the sonic frequencies. Then, silence. I switched to the next cassette, and the next. Each one contained a variation on the same theme, a subject desperately trying to communicate, trapped within the labyrinth of their own shattered mind. The recordings weren't just unsettling, they were meticulously crafted. Thorne had clearly anticipated every phase of Bellwether's breakdown, every potential resistance. There were moments of lucidity interspersed with episodes of intense disorientation, carefully orchestrated to maximize the subject's distress. I found one recording that was particularly disturbing, a looped sequence of flashing lights and distorted voices, accompanied by a low-frequency hum designed to induce a state of complete sensory deprivation. It had clearly lasted for at least 36 hours. As I continued to sift through the files, I noticed a disturbing pattern. Many of the entries spoke of delays in Bellwether's recovery, of unforeseen reactivity. There were references to adjustments made to the Blackwood Protocol to enhance control measures. This wasn't just a research facility, it was a prison, and Thomas Bellwether wasn't a subject, he was a captive. And the map, the access point level 3, wasn't just leading to a deeper level of experimentation, it was leading to a deeper level of horror. The air in the level 3 chamber was thick with the smell of dust, and something else. Something vaguely metallic, like old blood. The rows of files continued, meticulously organized, each labeled with a date and a cryptic code. Iteration 7. Stabilization failure, subject 12. Anomaly response gamma. It was the descriptions accompanying these codes that truly chilled me. They weren't the clinical observations of a detached researcher. They were accusations. Subject 12, Samuel Harding, exhibited signs of prolonged distress. Transport initiated 72 hours post session. Status unaccounted for. Subject 28, Eleanor Vance, displayed significant cognitive impairment following sensory deprivation. Presumed deceased. No body recovered. The unforeseen reactivity wasn't just a footnote, it was a recurring justification for disappearing subjects. I spent hours meticulously cross referencing the files, building a horrifying chronology. The initial protocols, the nutrient solutions, the sonic frequencies, the staged cognitive dissonance were still present, but layered beneath were accounts of escalating brutality. There were documented instances of physical restraint, prolonged beyond acceptable parameters, of invasive procedures performed without informed consent. Thorne's meticulous notes began to read less like scientific observations and more like detailed reports of torture. He wasn't just manipulating Bellwether, he was systematically dismantling the minds and bodies of everyone involved. Then I found it, a small sealed envelope tucked into the back of a file labeled Project Nightingale Phase 3. Inside was a handwritten note, scrawled in a hurried, almost frantic script. It was a series of numbers and symbols, a complex cipher. I recognized the format immediately. It was Ethan's personal log, the one he'd left behind during the trip. I dismissed it as a personal record, a way to cope with the experience. But now, with the knowledge of what was truly happening, it felt like a desperate plea. Decoding it took nearly 12 hours, aided by old encryption software I'd found online. The message was fragmented, riddled with gaps, but the core message was clear: repeat protocol, subject compliance optimal. Chronos data indicates remarkable consistency. Ethan designated as Control Group Alpha. Projected behavioral patterns exceed expectations. Recommend continuation of Blackwood Protocol. Requesting authorization for extended observation. It was a chilling acknowledgement of Ethan's unwitting participation. Kronos Corporation wasn't just observing, they were exploiting his predictable responses, treating him as a carefully calibrated tool. A cold dread settled over me. It wasn't just Bellwether, it wasn't just Harding or Vance. The entire group, perhaps dozens, had been trapped, subjected to this escalating nightmare, their lives reduced to data points in Thorne's twisted research. The robust control measures weren't about safety, they were about containment. And the access point level 3 wasn't a conduit to knowledge, it was a portal to a manufactured hell. The air in level 3 hung thick with the metallic tang of old blood and something else, a sterile, unsettling sweetness I couldn't quite place. I'd been meticulously combing through the archival terminals, the flickering holographic displays spitting out digitized records of Thorne's Operation Bloom. It was a relentless cascade of data, biometric readings, psychological assessments, detailed descriptions of the nutrient solutions, varying concentrations of nitrates, phosphates, and a disconcerting amount of something labeled simply Compound X. What chilled me most wasn't the cruelty, though there was plenty of that, but the cold, clinical observation. They weren't simply torturing us, they were studying the response. I found it tucked away in a supplemental file, a series of encrypted logs flagged as Subject Alpha Analysis Protocol. The decryption key was surprisingly simple, a sequence of dates corresponding to our days in the forest. As the text resolved, it confirmed my growing dread. Ethan's participation wasn't a random selection. His file was filled with the phrase remarkably consistent, repeated again and again, accompanied by graphs charting his heart rate, pupil dilation, and brainwave activity. He was a baseline, a control, a mirror reflecting their manipulations. The technicians, Thorne, Davies, even the perpetually grim-faced Dr. Albright, meticulously documented his reactions to the disorientation, the sensory deprivation, the increasingly complex cognitive dissonance puzzles. One entry, dated just a week before Harding's stabilization failure, described his vocal responses to a particularly jarring auditory stimulus. Subject Alpha exhibits a predictable pattern of vocalization. Initial agitation, followed by a period of marked stillness, lasting approximately 47 seconds, suggests a neurological